To be asked to help in anyone's crisis, whether it's personal, state, international, whether one is a doctor, a lawyer, a firefighter, an NGO activist, or a politician, is a privilege. For me to have been asked to speak here is a double privilege. First, the privilege of being asked to be involved at all in the deep crisis facing North Korea. Second, the privilege of being followed by speakers of such quality, seized of such knowledge of events, that any one of them could give this speech rather more eloquently, I suspect, than I could. But I must do my best and say what I can. The Commission of Inquiry, of which we've heard, could recommend either the creation of a special tribunal to deal with North Korea, or it could recommend referral of the situation in North Korea to the ICC. My experience is as a lawyer working in those courts that deal with crimes committed in armed conflicts and with crimes against humanity generally. Although there is no actual armed conflict, international or national, in North Korea, what these tribunals and courts tell us about judicial processes can be of relevance to any such process initiated for North Korea. To understand the way these tribunals operate in the way they do requires a longer and wider perspective that may at first seem pessimistic, but is not. It is both realistic and ultimately optimistic. For thousands of years, conflicts between tribes or conflicts between states or civil wars within states did not have external, non-involved states intervening simply because crimes might have been committed, unless it was in the interests of the intervening state to do so. Once conflicts were over, other states did not get involved simply to check whether there had been crimes committed in the course of somebody else's conflict, because the general rule in all things was that the winner should take all, including how to write the history of the conflict concerned. Some of you may know that as recently as the London Conference of 1945, that preceded the Nuremberg trials of the Nazi leaders, US Justice Jackson, who prosecuted at Nuremberg, justified this historic approach, making it quite clear that it was no part of the United States' function to interfere with the internal affairs of another country, even if they were exterminating their citizens. It has been, he said, a general principle of foreign policy of our government from time immemorial that the internal affairs of another government are not ordinarily our business. Jackson was determined to have a narrow definition of crimes against humanity, as he made absolutely clear, because if there was a wider definition of that crime, then the United States might itself have been said to have committed such crimes, for example, in respect of the Native Americans. And what this recent event shows is that the law can and will bend to political objectives. This was the philosophy at work in the Nuremberg trials and in the Tokyo trials. The philosophy of not getting involved yields when it's the desire of the victor to have a trial, or when there may be some other purpose, and it may be a very good purpose for having a trial. But we must remember, Winston Churchill would have shot the Nazi leaders had not Roosevelt and Stalin thought it a good idea to have the publicity of a trial, not so much a show trial, but certainly a trial. Now, the tribunals with which I have experience and the ICC to which North Korea could possibly be referred, established so recently in the last 20 years, some think, some hope, may have been driven by pure moral purpose and are free of political influence of objectives. The hope is they will not be the same as the tribunals reflecting that earlier philosophy. Sadly, thus far, many of these tribunals have shown that they are prepared to follow the philosophy of the earlier approach. To take a couple of examples, in the Rwanda conflict, the Tutsis did commit crimes. They were the principal victims. It has been impossible to investigate them. In the Balkans, you can find, if you look into the trials of which I have rather better knowledge, that Serbia has been absolutely determined not to honor the courts in a moral way, but to use them in a way to set best its record of history, to make its involvement in that particular conflict look as gentle as it might possibly be. That's the reality, and that's the reality we must all face as we contemplate whether any judicial process may be set up for North Korea. Because although human rights lawyers sometimes speak as if there is a body of law common to all people that transcends domestic laws, is almost God-given and universal, we have to bear in mind that maybe the one universal law recognized by all humans and all governments is this: never own up and massage the history to the extent you can. These are the realities before we move forward. And it's realistic to see the law and legal procedures positioned between the citizen and the state, or the citizen and international organizations. The citizen as victim, as perpetrator, as observer of crimes, has to regard the legal system as pure and reliable. Governments and powerful organizations that have control over the law know that however good the law may be, it will bend to their will when their interests are engaged. So what can the citizen do, recognizing this in the circumstances that we all face? Well, let me start in this way. Working with justice issues nationally or internationally, the rape victim or the genocide victim, it's quite clear that one of the most important things for victims and witnesses of crimes is that there should be left a reliable record of past events, that it is critical to the process of the recovery of a victim from crime or of a nation from conflict, or for a nation in the process of achieving reconciliation having been divided. Of course, we mustn't overstate the value of leaving a record as against, for example, the benefit to victims of the process of having a trial and bringing retribution. But nevertheless, the record is important. We should also recognize that although some people would see the record as valuable for the reasons I've given, others would see it as a good idea to bring conflicts to an early conclusion, not to trouble too much with trials for slightly less worthy reasons, commercial reasons, for example, as in Burma, to which I'll turn in a minute, or because the person wishing to see the conflict as being over has other reasons for hiding the truth, perhaps because it was a country involved on the peripheries and would rather not have the detail of its activities fully uncovered. Now, Burma is interesting. Can I spend a few seconds on it at least? Minutes may be. Many people outside Burma were aware of the human rights abuses that were happening. Many campaigned, in particular, to have a COI. The diaspora in England and elsewhere were actively engaged on this for years. As soon as Aung San Suu Kyi was released from prison, engaged in politics in a way that some considered reflected compromise by her, the international community has been far less keen to hear about human rights and perhaps even less willing to consider a COI or an international trial process. That has left the citizens who were involved, the diaspora, feeling completely let down, rightly or wrongly. It shows their experience the risks of putting all your faith in one, your faith and trust in a single outcome. Because if it doesn't happen, you land up having to deal with what you will regard as failure. What we've got to say in respect of North Korea is, yes, the COI could lead to judicial process, and we hope it does. But whatever happens, the processes in which we are engaged are not going to be marked as failure, even if it doesn't. And that's critical. But it's actually quite interesting to consider what happened to those who've been supporting Aung San Suu Kyi in London, for example, where I know because I've been slightly involved. To begin with, they were sort of outcasts. The international community didn't want to know them. They thought they were hardliners who should be kept quiet. Didn't take very long for things to change back. And even those with a commercial interest in Burma realized, as is the case, that you cannot let the history of human rights abuses go unrecorded and unchecked. Can I, in the time remaining, tell you about a couple of other things that you may know about, and in any event I would like you to consider? These are the ways in which, important ways, in which the citizen has in the past and very recent past been able to act where the international community lets the citizen down. First, there was the Vietnam Tribunal. What, you say? I don't remember the United Nations doing that. Well, of course the United Nations didn't do that, and America certainly didn't. But Lord Russell did, sitting with Jean-Paul Sartre and some other intellectuals in 1967, early on. They said, nobody else is going to deal with this. We will. We will call witnesses. We will record what happens, and we will give a judgment on what America did. And if you haven't read it, those of you who are students, go find it and read it. It came halfway between the time when the Genocide Convention was created and the time when it was first used in an indictment. And you may think that their conclusions are not far off the mark. A second similar tribunal, which is particularly important here, is the Japanese Comfort Women Tribunal. Here was a terrible human rights abuse well known at the end of the Second World War and well known to General MacArthur and well known to the Emperor. Nobody would deal with this in the same way that MacArthur wouldn't deal, the general who set up the Tokyo tribunals, would not deal with the Emperor at all. So in 2000, as many of you will know, because the Japanese Comfort Women affects Korean history very substantially, an informal tribunal was set up, presided over by Gabrielle Kirk-MacDonald, a former presiding judge of the Yugoslav tribunal. I imagine she and all the other lawyers gave their time free, and they took evidence. Nobody else was going to do it. they did it, and they left a record that, along with the Vietnam Tribunal, may well stand as a very important record in times to come. There are things that the citizen can do, whatever the international community chooses to do. And third, there was an informal tribunal last year in The Hague dealing with atrocities committed by another country that it is too difficult for the international community to face, Iran. Terrible killings in the prisons at the end of the 1980s. The diaspora of Iran put together at low cost a tribunal. Let me tell you three things about it. The lawyers were flown in, but they gave their time free, eminent judges. The conclusion against the Ayatollah's regime pulls no punches. It's fearless. But here are the two things you might want to know. The 100 witnesses who were called, many of them were called by Skype, free, from around the world. And the proceedings of the tribunal, a tribunal that the UN would never set up, were played straight back by the internet into Iran so that the citizens there could know what the record was of what their former regime had done. It seems to me, ladies and gentlemen, that there are three critical lessons that we can learn from the larger landscape that I have sketched in. First, don't trust major nations or international organizations to do what needs to be done. They may do it, but they may have reasons not to do it. And of course, if we think of the Security Council being asked to refer North Korea to the International Criminal Court, which is the only way that the case can get there, we have to bear in mind who has a permanent seat on the Security Council. Second, ensure that by whatever means, there will be a process that will be able to hold criminal leaders to account. Do not fall for the argument about the balance of justice and peace. Although there are good reasons for letting leaders off and letting them live in exile, all the victims I've spoken to and all the summaries one reads of victim reactions makes it quite clear that a justice system that threatens the impunity leaders have enjoyed means a great deal to the victims and can affect the future conduct of those who have committed crimes or who may be about to commit crimes. Third, recognize the incalculable value to witnesses, to victims and all citizens of countries emerging from conflict of having a good record left of what happened to them and their families. It's not necessary to rely on international organizations to do that. It is almost certainly desirable, however you leave a record of what happens, whether by a formal process, perhaps the continuation of the Commission of Inquiry, or by one of these informal tribunals, bear in mind that they are thought to work better or best when in combination with other processes, trial processes, compensation, lustration, so on. For North Korea, we are really fortunate that the United Nations made an inspired choice in getting Judge Michael Kirby to run the commission. He is a brave and a fair judge, and together with Sonia Biseko, a human rights worker of long standing, who has dared to stand up to her fellow Serb countrymen when they have been acting criminally in wars, they will not only allow all witnesses who can and who want to give evidence to do so, but will, to the maximum extent possible, ensure that the record of their proceedings is in public. They may or they may not recommend a justice process. Even if they do, as I've indicated, there will be difficulties in the way of it necessarily coming to pass. But by ensuring that everything they're doing is made public, they will achieve at least one of the things critical to the resolution of the misery that we know has been North Korea. And that will be not just the start, it would be much more than a start. It will fit well with the work already done, and when North Korea emerges from the madness of recent years, it will be possible to look back on the work of the Commission, perhaps on the work of a tribunal, and certainly on the work of all women and men of goodwill who have done what they can for the country, and to see how all these different activities will then be seen to be milestones in a necessary journey that North Korea must make. Thank you.